Good morning. I'm used to being in forums where I'm supposed to say all protocols observed, so I had to keep reminding myself not to start with all protocols observed. However, all protocols observed. My name is Eva Ayiera. I'm with the Center for Human Rights and Policy Studies. We consider ourselves thinkers, researchers, advisors on questions of security and governance because we think that's central to virtually every aspect of life. And what I've been asked to do today, and I want to thank AfriCOG for the opportunity for sort of this conversation with you, which is what we see it as. So what I've been asked to do is to consider some of the drivers of the endemic, as well as some of the emerging security issues that Kenya is facing. And obviously, as Gladwell and Njonjo have both pointed out, this emerges particularly as we're faced with an exposure of a vulnerability, the issues of terrorism that we're grappling with, and the realization that some of the strategies we're using are not yielding the results that we would like. And so what I intend to do in this 15 minutes or so is have a conversation with you on some of the issues that we think are creating a persistent, perennial insecurity situation. And some of them we've talked about for decades. Some of them perhaps we haven't paused and thought through. And so that's what we want to do today. And it's said that madness, or one of the ways that madness has been defined, is doing the same thing over and over again, and then standing back and watching and hoping that different results will emerge. And so what I'd like to hope is that these opportunities give us a chance to stop what we're doing, perhaps think through what we've been doing, and resist looking for different results from doing the same processes that we've been doing. Now, one of the things about security or insecurity in Kenya is that it has, obviously the pattern of insecurity has flowed from the economic, social, legal developments. So nothing unusual there. So politically, what has happened politically has always affected what we experience as insecurity. It's been fueled by issues such as violent crime. So there's also the perception that the current issue of the day is what we tend to then imagine as insecurity, whereas the problem of insecurity is much broader and touches on several things. So some of the issues that have informed the patterns of insecurity from Kenya's independence to present, issues of violent crimes, of course, are some of the manifestations, political actions which have been used as tools to oppress opposition. So insecurity through the political activities in order to sustain a particular status quo that favors a few and marginalizes others. Of course, then there have been land clashes, which have been driven by economic reasons, but also by political reasons. So there's been a range of issues that have been the source and sort of informed the pattern of insecurity that the country has seen. But when we look from the 90s, there's a sharp deterioration in security. And that's when the economy began to plunge. We had inflations at rates we hadn't had before. There was also a lot of intense political activism, at the same time intense counter-activism, counter-actions to repress political dissension and so on. We also see a significant spike in urban crime, in violent crimes. Carjackings become the norm. So from the 90s, even as the political situation became tense, as there was a push for multi-party democracy, even after that was achieved, the security patterns follow that. The thing that then we see about the waves of crime is that the responses we've seen from the security sector, and even the conversations that happen within the public spaces around questions of insecurity, have always shadowed what the waves of the crime. So when it comes to a crest, so when you have intensive carjacking incidents, then you find that there's a response that deals with that particular incident. And when that dissipates and so the conversation on security has not been as consistent. It's been shadowing the patterns of crimes, the waves of crimes, the waves of insecurity issues as they have come. And that's, in a sense, no different from what we're seeing now, because we're faced, obviously, with the very prominent threat of terrorism and the effects of that. And so the conversations around security are increasingly becoming around terrorism. So in a sense, sort of by looking back very quickly, if you remember in the 1990s and the carjackings, you remember the very prominent police hunt for Wanugu, Washushu, and that was played out in the media almost like this old Western where there were the villains and there were the police, cowboys and robbers. And when they were shot down, there was a sense of security is being restored. And there'd been this very public sort of pursuit of them, and then very public shootouts, and then it was reported constantly in the media that, security is being restored through these actions. And some of the police responses were like the flying squad. If you remember that there was a certain terror about if you had this 504 Peugeot, 5 men sitting inside, driving around at night, and the fear was if you're caught and, the disappearances that went with that. So this has been sort of the pattern. And then you come into the 2000s, the carjackings increase, issues of course, rape and killings that go with that. And then we also have, in the lead up to some of the elections, you have rise of vigilante groups as a major challenge, particularly in the low-income areas. But then the prominence of Mungiki, and then the response to that, the issues that were attributed to Mungiki actions and the response to that. So there's been that pattern of where there's a crest in certain kind of crimes, the responses have followed that wave. So what then would we consider drivers of insecurity? And in understanding the question of drivers, my focus was on the things that make security continuous, perennial. So in a sense, the things that make us keep doing the same thing over and over, not getting the results that we desire. So the things that, not just the things that create emerging security threats, but make it seem as though we're unable to deal with the threats even as they arise. So I want to suggest, there's obviously a long list, and each one of us could represent a different factor that has driven security, but I want to focus on about 7 issues today. One is the fact that even as we talk about police reform, we've had a police reform process, there's been calls for reforms for the longest time, and finally through the Constitution, obviously through the Ransley task force, there's been a lot of reform measures that have been instituted. But what we're seeing as a result of what is a very strong legal framework, but then we're seeing a very disjointed sort of piecemeal reform implementation. So what you end up with sometimes is a cosmetic reform process. It's not done as a cumulative. We're not seeing a pattern of one reform measure feeding into another, and building into something. But then it's going to be one activity here today, another here today, then it's dropped, something else is picked up. So there hasn't been a very continuous, unfragmented reform process. And while the reform processes have focused on changing particularly the administrative structures, changing the legal framework, there hasn't been a very clear sense of how do we reform some of the more difficult issues such as attitude, culture within the police institution, particularly the police, obviously the broader security sector, but then particularly the police. So that hasn't been one of the issues that we've seen as a consistent way. Another issue I want to suggest has been, even in terms of how we engage with security, or our perceptions as Kenyans in terms of what is effective security measures, we have a very low threshold or a very low level of expectation in terms of what should be adequate security response. So you find that there is popular support for strong arm policing tactics. I'm reminded in 2011, I think it was January 2011, there was an incident, I think along Langata Road, where there were these men who were said to be, I think, carjackers escaping, were lying face down on the road, and they'd all been shot. So the pictures that were carried in the newspaper, in one scene you find them lying prostrate on the ground, and then in the next picture they've all been shot, and so there's a pool of blood flowing. What was interesting was the responses that were carried in the media to that. So people said, yes, in any case, these people have been robbers, and responses like, unless you've suffered from carjackings and things like that, you can't talk about security. So there's, even whereas the security agencies have taken an approach of very strong arm, very usually militaristic, but very with little respect for human rights in terms of their responses to insecurity, that has also been championed. So the basis for even changing the approaches to dealing with insecurity does not have popular support, because the interpretation of what a strong response to insecurity is these strong arm tactics then. I found an interesting thinking about I think last year, the gentleman the police officer who had led the police hunt that eventually gunned down the 3 notorious criminals, Washushu, Wanugu, and Rasta. So, well-wishers had formed. He was said to be doing quite badly in terms of his economic status. So then there was this well-wishers coming together to see how they can help Daniel Serone, who gunned those people down, to improve his life. So some of the comments that were now in the string of the Facebook in response to this story was that he deserves a better life because he put down those criminals. So he's putting his life in the line for Kenyans. He's a hero. And so this is the kind of response in which whatever police actions, even where there are excesses, there is public support for it. So there isn't a very a complex sort of understanding of security and what responses, and even the marriage between security responses and the standards of human rights that ought to be respected. Another issue, I believe, is the criminalization of poverty. Or one would say the nexus between insecurity and poverty, in the sense that there's almost an acquiescence that as long as crime is kept in the low-income areas, that's tolerable. But as soon as it flares up into this issue that perhaps affects the entire nation, or alternatively affects the more, better off, the higher economic strata of society, then that becomes an issue that becomes a national agenda, national crisis. So on the one hand, toleration of crime at the low economic strata, but at the same time, the responses to what is considered insecurity tend to target the poor as well. So in a sense, people within low income levels are damned if they do, damned if they don't. So they're a source of insecurity, and the law sort of deals with them from that perception, but at the same time, they're the acceptable part of society, which if they deal with, they're living with insecurity, that's not considered a big problem for the country. So there's an element of criminalization of poverty. Poor people cause insecurity, but their insecurity is also tolerable. And interesting, actually, if we reflect on the recent response to the terror incidents we've had, for the bus bombings, what was the police's immediate response? The bus drivers were arrested. They've been charged in court. I'm not sure what they're charged with, because we had something about failure to prevent murder. I've still been looking for the act that specifically, creates the crime of failure to prevent murder, because in that case, we should all be in court being charged with failure to prevent murder at one point or another. So there's that reaction to the bombings of the buses. But at the same time, when you think about the responses to the Westgate incident, and this is not to say that the one is worse or better than the other, all of them create mayhem, create loss of lives that is unacceptable. However, the responses is what then we look at and question. If we don't address those patterns, those attitudes, then we're unlikely to deal with the real causes and the ways that we need to then address security. So then, I believe another factor is commoditization of security. And that's pretty much linked to what I've just mentioned about the nexus between poverty and insecurity. So when you commoditize security, as opposed to security becoming a right, it becomes a thing you earn. So in the same way that everyone is sort of in this race to move to a higher economic level, where also the higher up you go in the economic strata, then the more access you have to insecurity. In fact, I'd say the more you deserve security. So it's almost with an attitude of why do people who have nothing to protect need security? The more you acquire, the more then security you deserve, the more right you have to security. So security is not seen as a right, as an integral part of every human's existence and dignity, but as a commodity. The higher up you go in your economic status, the more then you deserve. But it's also interesting that the way the political class have then engaged with the question of security, and we've seen discussions by politicians about how there's a need for a dedicated police service, to deal with, because they're facing carjackings and burglaries at home. And so the focus is that they need a particular, a dedicated security machinery to deal with, to help protect them from the situation they're facing. But at the same time, within that conversation, there's a quiet acceptance that for the rest, that's just life. Deal, when you get out of that class, then maybe you're able to have a stronger voice. So security ceases to be a right, it becomes an economic opportunity, a thing that you get as you move up the economic hierarchy. A fifth issue is about disregard for local capacities, and Gladwell and both Gladwell and Jonjo have already attributed to this, by the idea that security is a technical issue, it requires technical discussion, there are security experts, they have been trained, they have been armed, and so on the question of even problematizing, identifying where is the source of insecurity, that has to be by experts, and therefore the solutions must also come by experts and those who are trained technically in these issues. But the odd thing about that is that the lived realities of insecurity are very untechnical, uneducated. It's what people deal with every day. But in the disregard for local capacities, then there's a failure to recognize that there are certain initiatives. Obviously, those who do not have access to state security apparatus, you're living in a low-income area, an informal slum, it's unlikely that the police patrols are going to be done to ensure that you're safe. More likely, it's going to be done to ask you, unaenda wapi, unafanya nini? So you're already the security problem. But within those contexts, security is a basic need that people have. So one way or another, people are going to figure out a way to secure themselves. There's a disregard for these initiatives that are happening, particularly for those who have been ignored by the security architecture, the understanding of security. And when we think about the current radicalization, terrorism, and issues happening along this line, then we realize that actually the solutions are not necessarily in the approaches we've seen. There may be some merit to those approaches, maybe not. That's a debate that I suppose some of my colleagues will handle. But the interesting thing is that there hasn't been an assessment of how do we tap into what local communities already know. You recall that the Nyumba Kumi initiative, the idea of it came up after Westgate, and we were told that perhaps we should look into what Tanzania is doing because they've had Nyumba Kumi arrangement in terms of managing security for the longest time. I wonder how many of you know that in Likoni, they have had Nyumba Kumi for years. The Likoni communities have been able to use that Nyumba Kumi structure to improve their security. But even as we talk about security, as we talk about Nyumba Kumi, we reach beyond the border because we're not aware of what's going on within the local community. So first of all, that isolation of the security conversation to just the securocrats, and then the exclusion of the regular people and the initiatives they're taking to secure themselves is a major gap and perhaps a factor why we then continue to respond to security without the success that we hope to have. It cannot be, even as we think about the challenges of insecurity and how to respond, we cannot divorce security, policing, and well, mostly the police is who we interact with. We cannot divorce policing from the political processes. The police will not implement a agenda that is different from the government of the day. So policing has always mirrored the values, the principles, the approaches, the intentions, the priorities of the government of the day. And in a sense, for those within the activist communities, those who are trying to push for democratic policing, maybe this is a gap that we have failed to identify, where we isolate the security sector. We think of reforms as happening separately, and we expect then that the reforms that happen there should have nothing to do with the agenda, the priorities, and even the approaches of the government of the day. So there's a need for a more integrated sort of view of how do we address then security, how do we address reform issues. Another challenge, which is probably the last one I will mention, corruption. I left that at the end because that's usually the first thing we mention as one of the biggest drivers of insecurity. But for me, beyond just the fact that insecurity, you can buy security or create insecurity for depending on, there's a price to either of the two, creating insecurity and creating security. There's a price that we have placed as a country, which is an unfortunate state of affairs. What is more interesting around the question of corruption is that because of the difficulty of dealing with it, we've grappled with graft for decades. Because of the difficulty in dealing with it, in removing this vice from the way we run the institutions, there's been a tendency to then isolate corruption as though it's a phenomenon that imposes itself on top of an existing, almost perfect system. So the idea is, I think of it, and this is a little bit of a crude example, I think of it as having a pimple on your face, and what you do is squeeze the pimple to clean it out, without thinking about what are the causes, what is it that's behind the face. So all you're doing is removing the blight. Corruption is not a thing that occurs to the institutions or is done by individuals. My argument is that it has become an integral part of the culture, of the attitude. Our posture is one that seems inclined to accommodate, incorporate, and function with corruption. So if we look to deal with corruption as this thing which just needs to be sliced off the top of the institution and then the institution will move smoothly, then we continuously run into these cosmetic changes that we actually don't really go anywhere. And if you think about it, the corruption, the institutions, the commissions, the bodies that have been set up to deal with corruption just keep growing by the day. We've had so many commissions of inquiry, we've had a lot of, the bodies and constitutional commissions, but it doesn't seem to go away because we've addressed corruption as a thing that happens to us as opposed to a way that we have oriented ourselves to behave and to act. And this also affects the security sector. So I think if we don't have a correct analysis, then we can't have a correct diagnosis and a correct treatment for it. So in a sense, my task is sort of then throwing out these issues which are not new to you, but perhaps creating a sense in which we can think about them, grapple with them, and think through how do we then go beyond here in terms of thinking of security and in the face of the challenges we're facing. Thank you.